Last week, as we talked about letting our conduct be holy, we mentioned how that at least it used to be that you got a conduct grade in school. And one of the entries in that conduct score would be the phrase, talks too much. So if you got an S on that, satisfactory, everything was good. If you got an N, it means you better start watching yourself. If you got a U for unsatisfactory, it meant when the teacher does the next seating chart, you're going to be sitting with all the introvert kids, none of them that'll talk to you. We know that in crowd settings, talking is a big thing, and teachers obviously have to keep that under control. And yet, as we look to the Scripture, we find that God regulates that also. You think about how much is spoken. I was listening to something earlier in the week, and as the two men were talking, one of them said, I think that probably the biggest sin, the most committed sin, would be that of fornication or sexual sin. And I disagreed with him in my mind, mainly because my thoughts were on this particular topic. But as I thought about that, you think about how even today, you look at the world as a whole, several places in the world hours ahead of us already. How many words have already been spoken today? How many conversations have gone on? How many couples may have exchanged angry words with one another already, or kids talking disrespectfully of parents? How many lies have already been spoken today? You can just go on and on with that. And so it should be no real surprise to us that when we look to the Bible, there is a huge amount that talks about the kind of words we're to use. Now, we're not going to try to in any way cover every category today, and I'll kind of show which direction I'm going to go here in just a minute. But as we start this out, I want us to begin maybe in a place that's not so typical for a discussion of this nature. I want us to think about how the Hebrew writer describes the words that we speak. And so I'm going to be going to Hebrews chapter 13. If you want to follow along, I'll have most of the, if not all the passages up on the screen. And I want us to note what he says, but we're going to get a little bit of a running start with that as he talks about what Jesus did for us. And so in chapter 13, we see how that Jesus suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through His own blood. So we're getting a picture here, as many things in the book of Hebrews, very much founded in things of an Old Testament nature, and how there was a certain amount of things that were considered unfit for the city that were carried outside the city gate. And so he's comparing Jesus to that in a sacrifice that's going to be made for us. And so here he is, the one who's taken outside the city, or we could just as easily put here, outside the camp, in order to suffer for us. And the writer continues and he says, therefore, let us go to Him outside the camp to bear the reproach He endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. And so much we could say about that. You think about even in Jesus' day who was in the city. It was those who refused Him, who rejected Him, the religious elite who would have nothing to do with Him. And so in a sense, the writer is saying to us, you need to come out of all of that. You need to realize who it is that you're following, and you join Him in His reproach. As the Apostle Paul would say, that we consider ourselves worthy to be counted in suffering with Jesus. That's what the writer's telling us. But now the part that I want us to see per our discussion this morning, based on these things. He then says to us, through Him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of lips that acknowledge His name. As the writer offers us the invitation to leave the city, to go out to be with Jesus, to join with Him in His reproach. He says what you need to do is to offer a sacrifice of praise. So in the midst of all of this sacrificial language that's having to do with Jesus, He now says one of the ways that you offer your sacrifice to Jesus is through the praise that you give to Him. And He adds to that then the fruit of our lips that confesses His name, that acknowledges who He is. In other words, the writer is saying, when you and I go to join Jesus because we admit who He is, we freely confess His name, he says it's like you're offering this fruit of your lips as a sacrifice to God. Hold on to that thought for just a minute. Let's now go to something the Apostle Paul writes. As he's writing to the Colossians, talking about matters of speech, he says this to them: let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And so we oftentimes, when we're teaching this, we'll talk about the preservative nature of salt, that you can put salt on meat to keep it around longer. Sometimes we talk about it with giving it flavor. Both of those are very good things. Yet, there's something else that needs to be a part of that conversation. As we're talking about what the apostle is talking about here, he's going back to the Old Testament also. And so in the book of Exodus, in chapter 30, beginning in verse 34, this is what the Lord tells Moses. Take sweet spices, stocti, onika, galbanum, sweet spices with pure frankincense. Of each there shall be an equal part. And make an incense blended as by the perfumer, seasoned with salt, pure and holy. You shall beat some of it, very small, and part of it you're going to put before the testimony in the tent of meeting where I shall meet with you. It shall be most holy for you. And the incense that you shall make according to its composition, you shall not make for yourselves. It shall be for you, holy to the Lord. Whoever makes any like it to use as perfume shall be cut off from his people. So the Apostle Paul, as he talks about our speech, he goes back to this rather obscure section of the book of Exodus, and he says, I want you to think about your speech like the incense that's prepared to be offered. And he says, what I want you to do in that sacrifice that you're making is I want you to include that salt that's pure and holy. And isn't it interesting just how serious God is about this when He says, if anybody just is going to use this around the house for their own perfume, He says, cut them off from the camp. This is to be holy to the Lord. Here are two passages, both New Testament passages from our Hebrew writer, from the Apostle Paul to the Colossians. Both of them bringing in sacrificial language and merging that language with what we say. And so I want us to think this morning about the speech that we use in that regard, that this is the fruit of our lips that we're offering to God. Now, what do we know about every sacrifice offered to God? It is to be pure and it is to be holy. In fact, many times we read the phrase without spot or blemish. And so we could think about that as our speech, that as we think about the words that we're saying, as we think about the thoughts that we're communicating, that just as a sacrifice was to require the very best, the fruit of our lips requires the very best also. And so when I think about approaching God and offering my speech, whatever I say today, as a holy sacrifice to Him, He says, I want it to be the fruit of your lips. I want it to be seasoned with salt so that it too can be pure and holy before me. Think about something that we find from the Apostle Paul in the book of Ephesians chapter 4. Verse 29, he says, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who are here. This passage Though the way it looks now maybe doesn't quite give the appearance of what I'm going to tell you here in just a second, it fits very well with this concept of the fruit of our lips. Because the word that we see here that's translated into English as corrupting talk, that word means rotten. It means the kind of fruit that you have allowed to get too ripe. You ever eaten a piece of fruit that's too ripe? This happens with bananas a lot, doesn't it? You think maybe just one more day I can get out of it. You eat it and you almost spit it out, right? Or here's an apple and you think it's going to be really good and you take a bite of it and it's just that soft feeling with that terrible taste. Paul says, don't let that be your words. When you're offering the fruit of your lips, don't let it be this overripe, putrid, rotten kind of communication. Just stay away from that. And so then, we take that a bit further, and we realize that God continues this picture in letting us know where that rotten fruit comes from. Where is it that this kind of talk emerges? Well, Jesus Himself told us that. And so we look at His words as recorded in Matthew 12, beginning in verse 33, when He says, either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad, for the tree is known by its fruit, you brood of vipers. How can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. But tree imagery, which shows up all through the Bible, Jesus says, consider yourself that tree. And if your heart is right, your words are going to be good. But if your heart is evil, you're not going to find these good words coming out of it. So then there's the warning for us. That we are going to make sure that the words we speak are not rotten. That they are not coming from a heart that is keen on things that are ungodly and letting that be known through the words that we use. Now at this point, we could go in so many directions with this. We could talk about the use of the Lord's name in a bad way or things about that side of the picture of our communication. What I'd like for us to do for the next few minutes, though, is to talk about our interpersonal communications, what we say to one another. Because much of what God talks about with our speech is dealing with that, the things that we're saying to each other. And so if we just want to start out with kind of a more general picture of this, what God is forbidding is any kind of speech that we're going to direct to each other that's harmful to one another. Anything that's going to cause problems, God says, I want you to leave that alone. I suppose the chief text that we could go to make this point would be James chapter 3. If we had plenty of time this morning, we'd just go down through that chapter because it is such an important chapter on learning what to say and not to say. Let's just focus, though, on verses 9 and 10. And I'll just remind you that chapter 3 is likely written to Christian teachers. It starts out by saying, let not many of you become teachers because you'll receive the stricter judgment. And he goes then into these words, so it's directed toward those who are going to talk publicly about spiritual things. I don't think it's limited to them. Because most of the things, if not all the things that are included in the chapter, we could say would apply to us in lots of different situations. But as he begins to come to the conclusion of the thought, he says in verse 9, talking about our tongue, our speech, he says, with it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. So for a teacher who's going to stand up and publicly proclaim the love of Jesus and then to go and talk hatefully about his brethren, James says that just can't be. That's just not right. And certainly we can make that application to anyone who loves Jesus. Any Christian who says, I love Jesus, but then goes and talks in an evil manner about a fellow member of the body of Christ. God says no. That is just not what should happen. That idea of cursing someone is to diminish someone's humanity. We might think about the Lord's words when He said, call no one a fool. Same idea. That what you're doing is you're saying you're really not worthy of my good speech. You're not really worthy of my good thoughts. And so James says, you don't do that to somebody else. You don't bless God and then come cursing someone else. And in fact, it flies completely against what Jesus Himself teaches. You remember as Jesus, in His teaching recorded in Luke 6 and verse 28, when He says, bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. He says, if somebody comes at you with a curse, then you return a blessing for that. That's our job. Not to diminish someone's humanity, but to help see that humanity as an image of God, as someone who needs the salvation of God. Paul, then in Romans 12, says something very similar when he says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. To diminish someone through our words is something that must not be a part of any Christian's life. So what do we see as ways that happens? I suspect that I'm going to the first category most people go to in talking about these things, and that's the harmful practice of gossip. Gossip is one of those sins that usually we don't view as very sinful. In fact, we oftentimes will kind of make a joke about it. Yeah, I know I ought not to say this, but... and then we go into it. Let's think about two ideas with that. One of the ideas presented with gossip is just simply talking too much. You just don't keep your words in control. It's not so much that you're really wanting to tear someone down. It's just the fact that you're always talking, and in the course of that conversation, you may say things you ought not to. This was a warning that Paul told Timothy to teach to young widows. Here's a woman still very much in the prime of her life. She loses her husband. And Paul says, you need to teach those young women to get married again, to raise families. He says this is the danger. They learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So here's a woman, and maybe much of her responsibility as a wife has been lifted due to the death of her husband, and she's got all this free time. And Paul says, make sure you teach these young women not to be gossips. And it's this idea that you're wasting this very valuable time that you have in conversations that are virtually useless. And so in this multitude of words, what ends up happening is you're spreading false or, at the very best understanding, misunderstood information. Just in this constant talking, you're saying things you ought not to. Paul says, don't do that. Now we look to a second part of what gossip is all about, which becomes much more severe. And it's not only that you're just talking too much, this is more of a vindictive nature. This gossip is to harm, as we just talked about. It's to be hurtful. We think about in 2 Corinthians, in chapter 12, verse 20, the Apostle Paul said, I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish, that perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. This particular usage of the word gossip has a little bit different connection. It's got a very interesting origin. It's an onomatopoeia word. So in other words, it's a word that sounds like the noise that it's making. And it's from the murmur of a snake charmer. All I learned about snake charming, I learned from Bugs Bunny on Looney Tune cartoons. So I can't say too much about it. But from what I understand, it's almost like a mystical, magical kind of thing that a snake charmer thinks he can do, where he's got this little guttural sound that he makes in the background, just constant, 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 constant. And so Paul takes that and he says, that's a lot like what this kind of gossip, it's just this continual. You're just always talking. You're always telling people about someone. And of course, the danger that we find in all of this is that usually it's an attack on someone's character. That here is someone who, for whatever reason, maybe your envy, maybe your jealousy, maybe just your dislike of this person, and in a way of trying to tear them down, you go to a friend, you go to a family member, whomever, and you just, like that snake charmer, you just start talking and talking and talking until you planted the doubt about this person. That's the danger here. And so we find the apostle saying, whether it's just idle talk, just talking too much, or whether it's very purposeful in trying to tear down the character of someone, this is rotten fruit. This is not the sacrifice you offer to God, and you best leave it alone. Now, we add a very similar word that pops up quite often in the Bible, and that's the word slander. Now, slander is not just very much different from vindictive gossip. In fact, basically the same. And I think the only big difference is when you talk about slandering, this is more of a campaign to destroy someone. It's not just your best friend you're talking to. It's not just family member. You're making an effort to present this to as many people as you possibly can, even to the point that we have laws against that, where you can sue somebody for trying to do this to you. Think about, again, an example of where this is used. Paul writing to Timothy, 2 Timothy this time, chapter 3. He says, but understand this, that in the last days, so this time Paul's writing after the resurrection of Jesus, continuing on till now, there will come times of difficulty. People will be lovers of self, money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable. And here in the middle of that list, slanderous. So let's look at a word origin again. I put the transliterated word up here because if you know Spanish or a similar language, you're going to see where this word derives. Diablos. He says, this is language of the devil. This time the snake's got you charmed. The serpent has convinced you to join with him in trying to tear someone down. That is a serious thing. And so the apostle says, again, you got to realize that there are going to be people doing this, but the implication is you don't be one of them. These are things that are destructive, things that you must beware of. And so then, we see what the Lord says, that this is originating out of an angry and a bitter heart. Paul, writing to the Ephesians, gives a picture of that. Where in the prohibition he says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you. Don't have anything to do with these things, because they are the rotten fruit of one whose heart has grown bitter. Let me just give a third category, just kind of a summation of angry speech. This would be like gossip, and it would be like slander in its vindictive nature. But it's not said about someone, it's said to someone. This would be the kind of language where you have gotten so riled up that you feel the great need to give someone a piece of your mind. And so you approach that person with anger, typically because of something that you believe has been intentionally done to you. Though it might have been unintentional, it is upsetting. And you've got yourself worked up into this furor, and you approach that person. And oftentimes, I would say most of the time, these kind of conversations are going to be unfiltered, because you're just letting the emotions spew. Does your boss ever advise you when you write an email, put it in the draft for 24 hours? Yeah, that's good advice. Because oftentimes, a good night's sleep calms us, right? But here's someone who's gone to someone who has spewed this at them. Paul's saying that's rotten language. That's language coming from a bitter heart. Ironically enough, sometimes this same kind of thing is seen with the lack of words, where we become so irate and so angry we just stop talking to someone to show that anger. I'd put it in the same category. Not an exercise of self-control where you're holding your words back, but rather you're going to teach that person a thing or two. Both of these ideas are all in this category of angry speech. So what do we do about it? When we think about these kind of things that would destroy the fruit of our lips, that are totally not seasoned with salt, what do we do about it? Well, as we have noted throughout, this is a heart issue. This is something where we've got to look deep down within inside of us and figure out if this is describing me as someone who is saying all these hurtful things to others. What's wrong? What's going on in me that I've got to change? Lord, in Luke 6:45, the good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good. The evil person out of the evil of his evil treasure produces evil, for out of the abundance of his heart the mouth speaks. When I take an honest evaluation of my speech, I got to ask myself the question that we're focusing on this year: am I holy in all my conduct? Here is a real-time, concrete example of how we know the answer to that. If I am holy in all my conduct, I'm keeping my mouth under control, just as James commands that we do. So, one who has the right heart has chosen to be holy in all of his conduct. It also means that I am making a concentrated effort to speak not what's going to destroy, but what's going to be helpful to someone. Let's go back to a couple of verses we've looked at already. Colossians 4:6, Ephesians 4:29. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it gives grace to those who hear. As I think about my communication with other people, the words that I speak need to help make someone better. So that's going to mean I'm not going around tearing people down. I'm not going around telling others how angry they make me, how much they've hurt me, how much they've done this or that to me. That's not helpful speech. I'm not going to someone in this unbridled emotion with an unfiltered mouth and just letting them have it. That's not what I'm doing. No. Paul says, when you offer your sacrifice, season it with salt. Make sure it's pure and make sure it's holy. And in both of these verses, there's a concentration on extending grace. Now, there's an idea, of course, in this of gracious speech, a speech that's good, pleasant, as we would think about even describing someone as gracious today. But I think we would be remiss if we did not talk about the attitude of grace in this. Maybe there are times when someone's hurt me. Maybe there are times when someone's made me angry. Maybe there are times when someone's done this or that to me. And so in my speech, I extend grace to them. And that may be a conversation that I need to have with this person. I understand you told X about this. I want to make that right if I did something wrong. That's gracious speech. That speech that's willing to go to the person first and have the conversation. Put ourselves kind of on the other side of that. When we are in the wrong and someone comes to us, I suppose maturity would say that no matter how the person approaches us, if I'm in the wrong, maturity would say I'd listen and change. But how much easier is it when it's someone who has always been gracious to you in their speech? When it's someone who has treated you as a fellow heir to the kingdom, a fellow human made in the image of God. And the conversations have been pleasant, and if there comes a point, maybe when something unpleasant has got to be said that I need to change, how much easier it is to listen to someone who I am convinced has my best interest in mind. That's gracious speech. And so certainly, if we can picture ourselves wanting to receive that, we should just as easily be able to picture ourselves in giving that kind of speech. So our heart is right with God. We're making that concentrated effort. And let me add just one other point with this. Sometimes it's just simply stop talking. Right? Just stop. The Bible speaks of that. It's probably the best known passage a little earlier in the book of James, where James says, you know what, brethren, be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. I don't know if James had Proverbs in mind when he wrote that, but he certainly could have. Throughout the book of Proverbs, chapter 10, verse 19. When words are many, transgression is not lacking. Whoever restrains his lips is prudent. Whoever guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he's deemed intelligent. Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him. I don't know how much clearer you can make it than that. These proverbs say, sometimes just stop what you're saying. Give yourself a good attitude check. And that's how the fruit of our lips will not be rotten. That's how we keep it pure. And so in practicality, it means that we take time to think about what's the very best thing to say and not say. That's what this teaches us. And so here we are as people who want to be holy as God is holy in all of our conduct. And here's one facet of that we're going to keep the fruit of our lips pure and holy and seasoned with salt. When Jesus was in his hometown, he went into the synagogue and he asked for the scroll of Isaiah and he read it to them and commented on it. And we're told this, they all spoke well of him and marveled at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. It'd be nice if we could stop the story there. They didn't take those gracious words to heart, but for this morning, I do want us to stop it there. Look at how his words are described. They marveled at the gracious words coming out of his mouth. If anyone had the right to berate people for their wickedness, for their contempt, it was the Son of God. But what he sought to do is to use his words for healing. Even for those who were in disagreement, those at times that he had to speak very sternly to, it was still with the intention of bringing them to salvation. And I want to conclude this morning just simply by saying he has spoken those gracious words to us. He's offered us the way of salvation. And I hope this morning that there's any who are not Christians, that you'll give that indeed some thought, that those gracious words are spoken to you this morning where he says, I want you to be a part of my family. And so if you need to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, now is the time to do that. Talk about using words graciously. To stand before this congregation and to say, I believe Jesus is the Son of God. What a wonderful thought. I encourage you to do that this morning. Or if there's a sin or a temptation we can pray with you about, we'll do that also. Let's make sure that we are right with this Lord who has spoken his gracious words to us. You can come now as we stand and sing together.